In past videos, you've seen me make bratwursts, Italian sausages, various breakfast sausages, and even a pretty unusual Mexican carnitas sausage. But I've never actually done a video making Polish sausage, so that's what today is all about. And because we're in the aftermath of a pretty good hunting season, this is going to be another installment in what I'm calling my unofficial venison series, and we're going to be making our Polish sausages out of venison. Well, half venison, half pork, because you really need to get some added fat content into your sausages. Anyway, there's a lot to do. We need to cut up and grind a whole bunch of meat, make a seasoning mixture, get everything all blended together, stuff our sausage casings, and then link them up into individual sausages. So let's get right into it and start making up this great big batch of amazing venison Polish sausages. First, let's take a look at the meat we'll be using to make these sausages. What I've got here is 2 pounds of venison meat cut up into some rough pieces. This is a mixture of meat pieces that came from the deer's shoulder and rear haunch, just cut up small enough to fit into the grinder. And I've also got an equal amount of pork shoulder, also cut up into some smaller pieces. Both meats have been in the freezer for the last hour or two, so they're nice and cold and also quite firmed up. Cold and slightly hard meat is ideal to run through the grinder, and freezing for just a little while achieves both. So I'll get my grinder set up, and for this I'm using the medium grind plate. Once that plate is in place, it's time to grind. I'll just start feeding those small meat chunks in, and I'll alternate between the pork and the deer so they start getting all mixed together. That super cold meat with that medium grind plate is looking exactly how I want. And I'll mention that I'm only doing a single grind. For certain types of sausage, I would run all this meat through the grinder again, generally with a finer grind plate. But for these Polish sausages, 1 medium grind is all I'm doing. And something I nearly forgot to include is the bacon. This recipe includes a ½ pound of thick bacon ground up and mixed in with that pork shoulder and venison. So I'll just grind that up real quick. Now I'll make my seasoning blend. I'll start with kosher salt, and then add some white sugar, marjoram, and black pepper. I'll also need some minced garlic, so I'll use my little garlic press and run about 5 cloves through it. Now to mix everything together. So to my ground venison and pork, I'll sprinkle in that dry seasoning blend, followed by the minced garlic, and I can't forget that ground up bacon, and finally some ice cold water. I'll mix it all together very thoroughly with my hands for a full minute or two. I'll keep mixing until the meat mixture starts getting tacky and no longer feels especially soaking wet. And by the way, a question I get asked sometimes is, why didn't you cure these sausages? Or why didn't you add curing salt? Well, these are considered, quote, fresh sausages and not cured sausages. I don't plan on smoking any of these or making them into a shelf-stable meat product. They're going right into the fridge or freezer. Accordingly, curing them doesn't really have any benefit in this case, and I prefer not to add a bunch of nitrites to my meat if the final product doesn't require it. At this point, I need to cover the mixture and put it in the fridge for 1 to 2 hours. This will let the ingredients really meld together and will also re-chill the meat. Throughout this whole process, we basically want our meat to stay as cold as possible. Okay, it's time to start making these sausages. This is my Lem 5-pound sausage stuffing machine. If you want to get into sausage making, you really need a proper machine. Using that clunky attachment on your KitchenAid mixer or meat grinder is painfully slow and simply doesn't make very good sausage links. Anyway, my Lem sausage stuffer is pretty simple to use. First, I'll just load up the cylinder with my meat, then slide it into the machine, make sure my stuffer tube is attached. Now to load the casings onto the stuffer tube. I'm using all natural hog casings. Whenever possible, I buy these from my local butcher. I've certainly bought them pre-packaged, but the ones from the butcher shop are simply higher quality, not to mention much longer. When you buy the packaged casings, you're basically getting miscellaneous leftovers, which means the casings are usually only a couple feet long or so. It's a pain to keep loading casings and stopping to tie them off and get a new one started. This whole bowl full of casings right here is actually one single continuous piece. That means I'll only have to load it up once for this entire batch of sausage. And I'll also mention that I upgraded my stuffer to the stainless steel tube. It's a little narrower and smoother than the standard plastic ones. This makes loading these hog casings especially quick and easy. I'll just carefully slide the entire length onto the tube, little by little. I'll leave just a little hanging off the end of the tube and give the machine a couple cranks until I see some meat start to come out. Then I'll tie off the end with a simple knot. Now I'll just start slowly cranking the handle with my right hand, and as the casing begins filling with meat, I'll gently guide it with my left hand to make sure it's filling with the rate and pressure that I want. This part takes a little practice to get the feel for it, but basically I want to make sure the casing is getting filled nice and evenly, but not overly stuffed. If I fill it too tightly, that will lead to splitting, either now or later when I go to twist up my links, or even later than that when I start cooking it. And if at any point I see a big air bubble start to form in the casing, I'll just use my little sausage pricker tool to poke a tiny hole in the casing to let that air escape. This tiny hole is too small for the meat to ooze through, and you definitely don't want a bunch of air trapped in there. As I crank out my sausage, I'll coil it up on the counter just to make it more manageable as I'm working. And some people like to twist the sausage into individual links as they stuff, one by one, but I personally find it more efficient to stuff the whole thing and then twist the links after. And once I've stuffed all the meat, I'll pull some excess casing off the tube, cut it, and tie it off with another simple knot. And you can see that one single casing was slightly more than enough to make 5 entire pounds of sausage. If I got pre-packaged casings, I would have had to reload 1 or 2 times during that. Now is when I'll twist up the links. So I'll gently pinch the meat through the casing right where I want to make my twists. I'll do 2 pinches at a time, one for each end of the link, to basically get the meat out of the way of the twist. If I tried just twisting through the meat, I'm basically guaranteed that it will split. So I'll make 2 pinches, give the link in between those pinches, 4 entire twists, and then move on to the next one. I'm going for about 6-inch long sausages here, which is just about exactly the distance between the tip of my forefinger and thumb when fully extended, so I just use that as my ruler. As I go, I'll recoil the linked sausages, again just to save space on the counter and make this whole thing more manageable. And when my links are all twisted, I'll go over each one with my sausage pricker tool. I'm just going to give 3 gentle pokes to each link. This helps ensure that as much air as possible is out of those sausages, which is important for the casing to bond with the meat. It can also help reduce the chances of splitting later on when you're cooking them. And if I see any obvious air bubbles in any link, I'll make sure to make a poke right at that spot. Next, I'll separate the links. Some people recommend refrigerating the links for at least a few hours before doing this step to really make sure the meat and casings have bonded and you don't risk a quote spill out when you cut them. But in my experience, this has never really been an issue. So using a very sharp knife, I'll just pull each link apart slightly to expose the twist and then slice it right at the center of the twist. Among the absolutely hundreds of sausages I've made this way, I've only ever seen an end open up and meat spill out maybe 1 or 2 times. Now all my sausage links are finished, and most of these sausages are destined for the deep freezer. So my very next step is to flash freeze them. Basically, that just means laying them out on parchment paper lined baking sheets and setting them uncovered in the freezer for a couple hours. Once the links are hardened up from being mostly frozen, I can safely vacuum seal them without risking the links just totally sticking together or becoming absolutely deformed and squished by the compression of the vacuum seal bag. So once they're nice and hard, I'll just load them up into some vacuum seal bags, seal them up with the food saver, and I'll have a ton of amazing Polish sausages in the freezer that I can thaw out and enjoy whenever I want. As for the links I didn't freeze, I'll just have to eat them within a few days, but I will make sure to refrigerate them for at least a full day first, again, to let those flavors really develop and to make sure the casing is good and bonded with the meat. So after a day, you know I have to try one out. It's freezing outside and I don't feel like grilling, but the cast iron skillet will work just fine to fry one of these up and give it a taste. Delicious, tender, juicy venison Polish sausage. It's not that much different than any of the sausage recipes that I've made on this channel. It's just a matter of what seasonings and other ingredients you mix in there with your ground meat before stuffing them into the sausage casings. And if you don't have venison or don't want to use venison, just make this recipe with all pork. Same quantities, proportions, ingredients, just use all pork instead of 50-50 pork and venison. And of course, I'll have the full recipe in a link in the video description below to how I made these sausages, including the seasoning mixture. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with our latest stuff, including future venison and sausage videos. Thanks for watching, and make sure the food you're eating is made out of food. And until next time, this is Great Lakes Prepping.